18 people are killed. That is an awful attack. I consider it as an attempt to put a terror on Ukrainians and a kind of revenge after Russians yesterday retreated and ran away from Snake Island.
To Ukraine, where at least 17 people have been killed in a rocket strike on a residential building in the city of Odessa. 30 people were wounded in the attack, according to Ukraine's Ministry for Internal Affairs. It's thought the missile strike came from a strategic aircraft from the Black Sea. We can speak now to the Ukrainian MP Oleksiy Goncharenko, who's also chair of the Odessa Regional Council in Kyiv. Good morning to you.
Hello.
I appreciate you're on a train, you're travelling, so we will persevere with this. Just tell us, if you would, what you know about this rocket strike in Odessa.
First of all, already not 17 but 18 people are killed. That is an awful attack. I consider it as an attempt to put a terror on Ukrainians and a kind of revenge after Russians yesterday retreated and ran away from Snake Island. Russian weaponry and Russian military units were destroyed on Snake Island.
I was going to ask you, this was an attack on an apartment building, wasn't it, in Odessa? Children also amongst the dead, and presumably there is still a search and rescue operation underway.
Yeah, absolutely. Excuse me for technical problems. Yes, there was attack on a residential building and on two buildings of summer camps where children were. And that's why we have so many casualties, and yes, children included. So at the moment, 18 people are killed, but rescue operation is still on the place. And we are afraid that number of victims can be more. And I didn't know, have you heard it or not? I think that this attack on suburbs of Odessa is a kind of a revenge from social part Putin and Russian Empire for yesterday's defeat on Snake Island, where they retreated from the Snake Island, where their military units were destroyed together with their weaponry. They called it yesterday a gesture of goodwill. Goodwill and Russia is not something which can be combined together in one sentence, unfortunately. So they retreated, and they are very angry with this. This is their new loss in the Black Sea. So after this, they just to make a revenge killed 18 people, just residential, just absolutely civilians.
And it's amazing that is the callous approach from Russia. I just wonder, as we introduced you as being the chair of the Odessa Regional Council in Kyiv, have you managed to speak to people in Odessa? Presumably they're feeling angry that is what Russia is doing, and that's its tactic.
Yeah, absolutely. I spoke with people, and people are absolutely furious. You can imagine the feelings of people. Unfortunately, it's happening throughout the whole country. Several days ago, it was Kremenchuk, where a shopping mall was attacked with a big number of casualties. Yesterday, it was Mykolaiv, and this night, Odessa. Every day, new attacks. They're killing and killing and killing. That's why we so desperately need air defense, anti-rocket systems, rocket intercepting systems that we are asking for our allies. Unfortunately, I can tell you yesterday NATO summit in Madrid finished, which I attended, and I can't tell you that by the way, I would like to thank the United Kingdom and the decision about £1 billion, thanks to the government, Prime Minister Johnson, but God save the Queen. But speaking about other packages which were announced, they are definitely not enough, even in humanitarian reasons, to prevent such awful tragedies like happened this night in suburbs of Odessa.
At least 17 people have died and 30 people are injured after a Russian rocket attack on Odessa in the south of Ukraine. It comes after the NATO summit finished, with Boris Johnson announcing the UK will up its defence spending to 2.5% of GDP by the end of the decade. The Prime Minister said the cost of freedom is always worth paying. Well, let's speak now to General Sir Richard Barrons, who's former commander of Joint Forces Command. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
Do you think this is enough to move from 2% of GDP up to 2.5%?
Well, 0.5% of GDP in the defence budget at today's prices is about another 10 or 11 billion pounds a year. So it's a substantial investment. The challenge is that the money is going to come in a few years. And over the next 3 years, actually, the defence budget will get a bit smaller because of inflation. And this is really at odds with the situation we're facing with Russia right now. And it reflects the state of our public finances.
I know you've said in the past you'd be keen for a 3% of GDP figure for defence spending. Just explain to us, what would that extra 0.5% get you?
So we're going to have to do a number of things with defence to make it up to the challenge that we now face in the 21st century. So defence is going to have to get bigger. It's going to need more people because it's going to have more folks in mainland Europe all the time, and that will just put a bigger strain on the existing manpower. It'll need more and more modern equipment. There's a process of transformation underway in defence, which is doing to defence what the digital age has already done to how we live, work and play. And behind the scenes, but just as important, defence has to be restored to a state of resilience so it can endure in the sort of long war we're seeing now unfolding in Ukraine. And that just means buying missiles and ammunition and spare parts and actually having them on the shelf. Because you can't have them made in a crisis. What do we need, I guess, to learn from the invasion of Ukraine? Because we've seen that actually what's really been useful for Ukrainians is giving them weapons. We haven't had soldiers on the ground in Ukraine. We've been training Ukrainians, some in this country, but we've been pouring weapons into the country. Isn't that maybe the future rather than the boots on the ground? No, I don't think that is the case. We're actually, in a way, fortunate that this war is between Russia and Ukraine and not between Russia and the rest of us. But we now need to recognise the nature of Russia and the threat that it poses to our security and our prosperity and our values. And that isn't going to go away, even if there were to be some sort of settlement in Ukraine, which strikes me as unlikely. So the lessons from Ukraine are many, and they include that war is alive and well in Europe in our time, in its brutal and feral and destructive state. And we have to re-gear ourselves up to be able to manage that at home, which is about resilience, as well as fighting with our allies or being prepared to fight with our allies in NATO. There are some equipment lessons. I mean, precision missiles are much in evidence, but so also is the mass use of artillery and armor, and we need to modernize that for the 21st century. And then we need to recognize that things like data and cyber and drones, which is a form of unmanned and in future robotic capability, all of that is changing how war is fought. So there are major lessons in defense transformation here.
If we're talking about standing up to Russia, isn't that what the nuclear deterrent is for?
Well, that's a very interesting point, because for the last 30 years or so, NATO, including the UK, have pursued a policy of deterrence by punishment, essentially saying to Russia, we aren't going to deter you with a big conventional effort. So if you invade NATO territory, we'd expect you to be able to do that and to get away with it. But our nuclear deterrent is the thing that will punish you for doing that. And now we're going back to a different form of deterrence, in the jargon, deterrence by denial, which means that we're not going to allow Russia to be able to occupy NATO territory. And if you look at the likes of Estonia, well, Russia has already occupied areas greater than Estonia in the war in Ukraine so far. And Estonia and many other countries not enthusiastic about being occupied by Russia and then hoping NATO will turn up 6 months later. So we're going back to deterrence by denial, and that means conventional forces as well as the nuclear deterrent. It's a much more effective recipe.
But how is that going to help Ukraine now?
So we're going to do at least two things for Ukraine now. We're recognizing that Ukraine will win because its will and its people, its men and women who are going to fight, are going to be connected to our will, our money, our stocks, the sorts of weapons we've sent so far, and our industry. And this has parallels with the way the US supported Europe in the Second World War. So we're going to support the war effort directly with training and money and will. And just as important, we are all going to contribute, as we are now, to bearing down on Russia's isolation as a pariah state
through sanctions and refusing to allow them to participate in international life. And that's an important part of breaking Russia's will to continue this absurd invasion of Ukraine.
Boris Johnson has made it very clear that he is not going to reverse the cuts to the size of the army. He's been insistent at this NATO summit that actually it's more important to spend money on better equipment.
So right now, the army specifically has a set of equipment. This is really from the 1990s, and it has to recapitalize. So it definitely needs equipment, and it also needs ammunition, stocks, and more training. So it needs more than manpower. But in the future, it is going to need more manpower. And that will be a mixture, not just of the regular army, which is the subject of a cut right now, but I think a much bigger and revitalized reserve force, which is cheaper to own, even if it's as expensive to use. So the army is going to transform itself, and the Chief of the General Staff is setting out the direction for that. It will take some time. It will include people, but in a different recipe.
Why Britain and not other countries?
Well, I think Britain is absolutely bought into collective security, which is NATO. We are, after the US, the second major spending power. We're a really big influence on NATO, and others will have to carry their end of the log just as well. And you can see this happening with, for example, Germany spending an extra 100 billion euros this year and going to take itself up to 2%. So we're not alone in this, but we should recognise collective security is a pay-to-play venture. You have to contribute in order to benefit, and that's what UK, I think, is now setting a very much better example.
General Sir Richard Barrons, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
He is former Commander, Joint Forces Command.